Hey everyone, and welcome to Bright and Early, the podcast for people building early stage startups. I'm your host, Brian Ray. I talk to entrepreneurs, product people, designers, and marketing pros to learn what works, what doesn't, and why, giving you at least one thing to apply to your business first thing tomorrow. My guest today is Joel Gascoigne. Joel is the founder and CEO of Buffer, a platform to help build your brand on social media. Joel, welcome to Bright and Early.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Brian. Excited for this conversation.
Me too. And we found out right before I hit record that we're both in Boulder. We could be doing this in the same room, it turns out.
Yeah, that's fun. We'll have to hang out in person soon.
So what we were talking a little bit. What brought you out to Boulder, and what
Yeah, me and my wife both love the outdoors, and we were in New York City before Boulder, and it's a great city. There's a lot going on, but it's nice to just be somewhere a little bit more low key and with like really great access to the outdoors. So I love skiing, I love hiking, mountain biking in summer, and yeah, it's a great place. I love the sunshine here as well.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about remote work. And so is it fair to assume that your decision to relocate from New York to Boulder was like no effect on the company or what at all? Or were there some implications that you needed to think through and work through from a remote work standpoint?
Oh yeah, very, very minimal implications. I've moved, I can't even think of how many different places I've lived while I've been working on Buffer so far. It's been about just crossed 9 years since I started the company, and yeah, I've been all over the place. So, and especially moving from New York to Boulder, time difference is minimal.
Yeah, right.
Made very little difference. I would say the one thing is that there tends to be a few more people in the company in New York, and people travel through a little bit more. So maybe like seeing people, a little bit less, at least, those kind of serendipitous meeting. But, I think on the whole, it's been a great move. Actually been really great for my energy levels. I feel like I had to leave New York to realize that a lot of my energy was just getting sapped, kind of like, being in the city. There's just a lot of people and things, and it might be energizing for some people. For me, I enjoy somewhere a little bit quieter, so it's been great.
Good. Well, maybe we'll run into each other on a trail someday.
Yeah.
I think how many employees does Buffer have now?
We just hit 90.
Okay.
So,
it should be like, and anybody who's listening to this is most likely already kind of on the train, but it's quite an endorsement for the remote work model that the CEO can move and it has a minimal effect on operations.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're a little unique because we have no office whatsoever, like at all. We don't really have a hub. There's different levels of remote things, and we are fully distributed. There was a time earlier in the company where a good majority of the executive team were in a single place. That makes a difference. But we've not been that way for a long time. So yeah, very easy. And it's been quite a deliberate thing for us to try and make sure that everyone has that kind of freedom.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, is if Buffer had an HQ and you don't. So then my next question is, how many time zones do you span, or maybe more importantly, like what is the stretch of zones, and how do you manage the overlap?
Yeah. It's really spread out. We have people in Australia, several people across Asia, and then Europe all over the place, and then US, Canada, South America. It's kind of just everywhere. So yeah, and I'd say that the majority is kind of US or Americas and Europe. So then it's really the kind of Asia, Australia time zone that's the one that can be the hardest to make sure we're being inclusive about.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's dig into that issue then of being inclusive for those folks. Talk to us about the practical logistics of a company all hands or just even a leadership meeting? How do you plan
Yeah.
those? And
Well, it's interesting. Right now, we are kind of fortunate on the leadership team side because we at least only span the US and Canada and then Europe. And so, but we only have one person on the leadership team in Europe, and so that person can sometimes feel like, oh, there's discussions happening, or things progress without them. So we have to be a bit conscious of that. But if it was, I've spoken with a couple of other remote companies that have at times had leadership teams spread across Asia, like US and Europe, and that would be very challenging, I think. I think we would always try and find a way. And I actually recently spent a couple of weeks in New Zealand working from there, and I've spent time working from Japan before, other places in Asia. So from time to time it happens and we figure it out. But yeah, I think when it comes to all hands, it's recorded. Generally, those folks won't be on the call. We do try once in a while to mix up the timings of those things. It's something I will say we don't do as much as I might like, but I think logistically it's just hard. But I would, and then the other key thing with it is that we've recently made a bit of a push to actually specifically hire people and find folks in those time zones where we have less people, because we really do want to balance it out a bit more. It's beneficial for culture, but also for customer service, having people in that time zone and customer service team, things like that. So I hope that will over time also just balance things out and help us do a better job with those time zones.
Okay. So just to get real specific on that, you mentioned it may be clear to listeners, but about shifting the time zones of those all hands meetings. What I've heard some companies talk about is they have a monthly all hands meeting. This month it's at 8 a.m. Eastern, and then the next one will be shifted 8 hours, then the next one shifted 8 hours, so that it's kind of constantly cycling around the globe.
Exactly.
That what you
that's what I mean. And that's something we have done in the past. We've not really done that too much recently, but I think it's a good idea to do it. I think the other thing is just I try to take kind of every opportunity I can to go and spend a few weeks working from that time zone. I think then, and so anyone in the leadership team especially, I think that's a great thing to do. Start to really get an understanding and empathy for, because you go on Slack and there's just no one around, and then it's also interesting things like end of the day can get suddenly very busy as people are coming online. It can be really hard to switch off in that time zone as well. So
another real practical question around time zones and particularly leadership issues. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, and their question was, from time to time, there's like, we need an emergency meeting of the leadership team. Something major has happened and we need to talk in 2 hours. You have people spread across the world, and maybe you've even encouraged people to turn off their notifications. So what has that come up with you all before? How do you approach that when we really do need to get executive team on the call in 2 hours? How do we get a hold of everybody?
Yeah, so we have a internal document or kind of something in Notion where we have everyone's contact details. So we've got phone numbers in there. So really we'll start, texting, calling if we need to. This has not happened for several years, so kind of knock on wood. It's it's really something you hope isn't necessary too frequently. But we are fairly mature as a company now, and so it's definitely something I can think of several instances of that in the first 3-4 years. I think with the remote work, especially early on, if you choose to be fully distributed at an early stage, then I think I kind of see it as like, you gain flexibility, but you've got to be flexible as well. So kind of, being available to jump on a call if there is an emergency, I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. Interesting. And do you and so do like does the product team, engineering team, marketing team have a similar document of everybody's contact information in case of emergency? Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, it's actually a single document for the whole company. Okay. So yeah, just everyone's is in there, and that's handled by the people team now. So anyone that joins is gonna get added to that. It's pretty streamlined.
Okay, that makes sense. Something that Buffer contributes to the remote work community every year that adds a ton of value is the state of remote work survey, and then the way that you all publish it, just like super readable, tons of great information. One piece of it that I'd love to talk to you about and get your thoughts on, like maybe the top 3, is when you ask, what's your biggest struggle with working remotely? Yeah. So the top 3 that people list, at least in 2019, was unplugging after work, loneliness, and then collaborating and or communication. So can we just start with that first one, unplugging after work? What are your thoughts on that? Why do you think people struggle with that? And what does Buffer do to help your own employees not have that problem?
Yeah, I think that one usually comes from, I'd say, a couple of things. One is time zones. So generally in a remote team, you do have multiple different time zones. So the concept of working hours really is something that most remote companies don't have, and actively kind of avoiding in a way. I think there's this concept of it's about getting the work done. It's about the results. It's not about the time you put in. And I think that's a really positive thing, but it has this flip side challenge of, well, when does work actually finish then? And then the other key thing is where you're working from. Most people are working from home. And so there's kind of this zero separation, or much less separation between work and personal life. So I think the combination of those two things makes it, remote work especially susceptible to people being, finding it hard to unplug after work. Yeah. And in terms of some of the things we do, we really encourage people to have all their notifications and their kind of time off set up in Google Calendar and Slack and things like that. And then we also, I think, Buffer as a company, we're very kind of sensitive to each other's, time off and things. So in the evenings, we're generally pretty aware of, we try and encourage people to, really be aware of where everyone else is in their team, especially if they're traveling or something. And then one thing, for example, is by default Slack, if you have, if you mention someone's name, even if you don't add them in Slack, it will actually notify them that you've mentioned them. And so we'll even kind of avoid mentioning people's names in full. I think, sometimes maybe go too far, but I think it's actually a really good thing that we're all trying to support each other in that, because we know it's a challenge we have overall.
Yeah. It's the double-edged sword of being able to work remotely, is that we make it a point to be able to work from anywhere, which is great. Unfortunately, it means that we're able to work from anywhere. So there's always that temptation. I think another thing that you see pretty often is that the number one concern of many like untrained managers, so to speak, who are getting ready to go remote, is that their employees won't get their work done. In fact, the opposite is true. Remote workers work more hours, and, for all sorts of like psychological reasons that factors into that. But
it's funny how often that question will come up, and how it's really never been the problem. The opposite is the problem.
Yes, right. That's right. Yeah. Is burnout specifically, associating that with unplugging after work, is that a topic of conversation that you all bring up regularly at Buffer and have some thoughts on how to mitigate against?
It's a big topic for us right now, and more so in the last year or two, just with the the time we've been going. And luckily we have very high retention in the team. So we have a lot of people hitting 4, 5, 6, even 7 years at the company and working remotely that whole time. It can be an issue. Something we've really tried to be a lot more vocal about, and also just having a lot more discussions in the team. So we introduced sabbaticals recently, and
really,
we've had our first 2-3 people who've taken sabbatical. So it's 6 weeks off after 5 years at the company, and that's in addition to the normal time off you would take.
Yeah, in addition to your just standard vacation time.
Yeah, and it's really encouraged us that 6 weeks in one block, and you really have a plan, and you give a lot of notice for it, and you really unplug fully in that time.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry if I missed it just there. Is it a suggestion or a requirement? If you're going to take sabbatical, it has to be 6 weeks straight.
It's a strong recommendation. We've not had anyone not do it that way. I don't think it would be that effective. And also, timing is important and varies per person. So people have different things going on in their life. Mm-hmm. Maybe after 5 years isn't the right time, or maybe they still got a lot of energy. They're feeling like, I just want to keep going. So we basically do it where it's 6 weeks after 5 years, but for every additional year where you've not taken the sabbatical, it'll be an extra week. So after 6 years, it's 7 weeks. Okay. And so, yeah.
I love that. I love that policy. Have you taken yours?
I have somewhat. For me, I actually reached a breaking point with burnout in 2017.
Really?
And so I took a little bit of a kind of an emergency sabbatical, but I wouldn't really call it a full sabbatical because it was about a month. It wasn't really, and I think I sometimes still feel a little bit of burnout at times. I have after I took that month off, I became a lot more disciplined with just regular vacation, weekend trips, fully disconnecting at the weekend from work, having other hobbies that I was trying to really bring back into my life. It's useful being in Boulder. It's easier. But yeah.
Plenty to do. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. The second thing on the survey that remote workers struggle with is loneliness. And something I've been thinking a whole lot about recently. I'd love to get your thoughts on that particular struggle and how you've observed it.
Loneliness is a big challenge. And I think a lot of times it's because people will work from home or work from a coffee shop or something like that. Or even if you're working from a co-working space, it's different than being in an office with co-workers that you're actually working like together with. So it's very easy to end up having very little social kind of contact or kind of surface level at a coffee shop, a co-working space, kind of that kind of thing. And then additionally, some people in remote companies take advantage of traveling and working while traveling, and that can make it even harder because you're just switching the whole kind of city of where you are, and you probably don't have friend groups in all of those places and things. So it can be a really big challenge, and it's something that it's important to be quite deliberate about and try to create. It's one of those things where when you work in a company with an office, you kind of take it for granted. You don't even think about it. You're getting this kind of social recharging
passive
every day.
Recharging, yeah.
But without that, you've got to actually deliberately seek it out. Make sure you try and get lunch with a friend a couple of times a week, or just do those kinds of things.
Yeah. Are there beyond just like the list of things that you just mentioned there. Like, yeah, you need to be deliberate about it. It doesn't happen by just happenstance the way that it often can in an office. Those are great suggestions. Are there any, practical processes or, automated things that Buffer has put into place that you found to be particularly helpful in making sure those things
Yeah.
happen?
One of the things we've done, which I think is very helpful, is we have something called masterminds, and we basically pair two different people from totally different areas of the company together, and generally at kind of a similar kind of level. So they basically have a lot, kind of very much peer relationships, so they have a lot to talk about, and that can, I think, be really useful for this as well. It's just someone to talk about various different challenges, both for personal or anything really. So that's one thing that we've done deliberately. Another thing we do is that we generally any single person in the team will generally meet up with other team members at least 3 times a year. I would say we have once a year we have an annual retreat, the whole company together in a certain place, and then we also have what we call on-sites, which are individual team meetings that happen. So that also happens at least once a year, and it's usually spaced out about 6 months from the retreat. So that's already kind of 2 meetings. And then we have some other things in between, like the customer advocacy team has their own kind of retreat as well, that they call advocacy camp. That happens once a year as well. We have a gathering of product marketing and engineering, which we call the summit or product summit. That also happens that's something we've just started doing last year, but it's happening once a year. So it's always evolving as we grow. But so for example, when we were smaller, when we were 20, 30, 40 people, we would just have a whole company retreat 2 to 3 times a year. It was 3 times a year at one point. And so it's kind of easier when you're smaller. As we've grown, we've realized, okay, the whole company retreat's great, but it takes a different form as you get bigger. It's maybe more about bonding and building those relationships. It's maybe more high level. It's not really jumping in, getting a lot of work done together. So that's why we brought these individual team on-sites as these other meetings. So it just, that's been the evolution we've seen. So that helps a lot with loneliness as well, because you know that you're going to have these multiple touch points throughout the year with the team.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and you mentioned the masterminds, that's like a manual pairing, like somebody's going through and saying, this person's at about the same level as this person. They're in different functions, pair them together.
Yes.
Is there something during your onboarding process that is, I guess just talk about the onboarding process and the relational component of it, in addition to the like content delivery, paperwork, blah, 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 component. How do you work on that?
Yeah, something we've had in our onboarding process for a while is that, you will obviously meet your team and your manager and all that. But you're also connected with someone that we call your culture buddy, and they kind of really help you figure out the culture of Buffer. And they're usually someone on a whole different team as well. So you're connected with this person, and it's someone to ask questions that might maybe feel stupid. It's like, what's this word that people are using? Like, I don't know what this is. It seems to be like a Buffer thing. Things like that. So you kind of have this go-to person. And that's been really effective. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How long have you been doing that aspect of it, like the culture buddy and the mastermind buddy? Okay.
Yeah, I would say 6 years, 7 years, maybe. Okay. We've done that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it strikes me as that could even be helpful at a below, even 10 and 15 employees level. Like even when everybody still knows everybody, just having that like go-to for certain person to ask during the onboarding experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Are there any, just thinking through like the tooling of that there's the standard set of tools that remote companies use, like Slack and your project management and Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any tools that you found particularly helpful on this onboarding and kind of HR culture, like that whole area?
Yeah, that's a good one. The tool we use for the pairings is, so the masterminds, we do that manually, but we do have something else that we basically do an ad hoc. It's something that people can opt into, and it used to be called pair calls. And basically that this evolved a little bit over time, but it's essentially the idea of once a week you get paired with someone else totally at random. And there's a tool we use called Donut that does that. And so that's been really useful. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. You should maybe interview our head of people. No, she would have a lot more ideas.
Okay. Are there? So I'll ask you about a couple specifics that other people have mentioned to me, like 15.5 or Tiny Pulse, or do you find those valuable?
Yes, we've just started using Tiny Pulse, so we're excited to see how that goes. We've been using Culture Amp for a while.
Yep.
We used to use Office Vibe, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
That was great. I think these tools are all really key. You do kind of need something along these lines. I think over time we've tried to go towards more specialized tools for these kind of things, whereas in the early days we might have kind of piece something together ourselves just with paper docs or things like that.
Right. The third one here on the list is, and it's a big one, is collaboration and communication. So that's like every company period. Like if you're 5 people in the same office, you're going to struggle with communication.
Yes.
And throwing people around the world across functions, it just amplifies that. So how have you addressed that, and what are the most common things that you see people struggle with?
Yeah, I think something that we try to ingrain very early on is that we really need to over-communicate. Written communication is going to be the primary form of communication, so we've got to be really good at that, helping people level up and improve that. So we had a lot of kind of explore how to approach that. And then I think one of the most interesting things potentially to talk a bit about as well that we've really tried to think about recently. About a year ago, we started using a tool called Threads. You may have come across Threads.
Yeah, I have.
So Threads is a whole new kind of collaboration and communication tool that we've added in, and it's kind of filled this middle area between email or between paper docs or Google Docs or that kind of thing, and then Slack kind of on the other end. So it's not really for documents in the way paper or Google Docs is. It's more for discussion, but longer form discussion than Slack really is built for. So that's something. We still use Slack, but we've found Threads to fill a nice gap that we over time really started to feel the pain of.
Okay. Yeah. And did I hear you mention, am I remembering this right, that you're using Notion for some, does that function like the company wiki, like
exactly
longer form static information?
Yeah. So it's really static, evergreen information with that, has that sidebar hierarchy. So it's really easy to navigate and find things. Just company information, how does this work, all the processes, those kind of things. That's what we try and put into Notion. Whereas we use Dropbox Paper a lot as well, and that's really more for like working documents that are evolving all the time.
Interesting.
Changing. So a product spec or something like that will be in Dropbox Paper, at least maybe until it's completed, and then it might be kind of shifted over, or just like linked to from somewhere in Notion.
Yeah. How do you make sure that the wiki is a like a living, relevant document? A lot of times a wiki gets created and it is never seen again for 3 months until somebody brings it up and, whatever.
Yeah.
How have y'all gone about the process to make sure that it's a useful thing and a time saver?
Yeah, it's definitely something that can happen. I think it's important to have someone that is really trying to own that and is feeling responsibility for it being fresh, it being up to date, and organizing it as well. So for us, that's the people team who are taking on that role.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are really trying to make an effort to include links to Notion from different places, suggesting that those are added to different documents and things, and then also just hitting up different people, especially leaders across the team, to say, oh, could you put this into Notion, or just suggesting that we do that. So yeah, it's kind of, I do think you really got to think about it as something that needs to be like, it's like a garden that needs to be tended to and worked on. So yeah.
So still thinking about communication and collaboration here. There's like the common constellation of like email, chat, project management, your wiki, a video tool. Does that feel about right to you? And do you all have preferences on organizing those tools internally?
Yeah, that's about right. Since we've introduced Threads, we've really stopped using email almost entirely, which has been very welcome change for everyone. One of the things for us with email was that because we also have this huge focus on transparency, we had this concept of transparent email for a long time, which some people might have heard about. It's essentially, any email would be CC'd to a list, but everyone would be on that list. It was a kind of a way to categorize all the emails. So the neat thing with Threads is that Threads has spaces, which is essentially kind of categories of posts or of discussions. And so we don't have to do that manually ourselves. Right. And it's, so, and email is used for other things, external communication things. So that this still has that purpose, but it's definitely been a breath of fresh air to change that setup.
What are the expectations on a response time in Slack versus Threads versus a mention in Dropbox paper? Is that something that you have quantified internally, or is it like feel and vibe?
Yeah, I think so. There's kind of the expectation of response time, and then also the expectation of what you use those tools for. So if it's going to be a more meaningful, important discussion, we really encourage that to happen in Threads and not happen in Slack. And that means that the discussion can span multiple days. And so therefore that kind of ties in with the expectation as well, which is that a response will be, within a day or so on Threads. If it's so really we try and Slack is more used for, maybe quick back and forth communication throughout the day with somebody that you're actually working closely with. But nothing in depth that other people in your team that might be in different time zones are going to have to kind of catch up on, because that's just like lost in Slack, right?
Painful.
So I think with that, with Slack, there is maybe an expectation of within a couple of hours, but I think it's also very much with thinking about respecting that people are doing other things throughout the day, maybe getting lunch or working out or taking kids to school or things like that. So it's I think we try and be aware of those things that different team members that we're working with are doing, and so there is an expectation that we'll be able to have back and forth on Slack, but I would say over time for us it's become more asynchronous and like much lower expectation of that. And I think Threads has helped us with that, because I think before Threads we would try to have some of these bigger, more important discussions in Slack, and it just wasn't working. But it also creates this feeling from everyone of, oh, if I don't jump in now, this thing is going to be lost up in the stream. Yeah. And so I have to jump in. So it kind of created this awkward need to respond quickly. Yeah. Whereas now with threads, that thread is not going anywhere. It's nicely categorized. You can mark it for follow-up if you want to. Yeah. So that kind of saves it for you. And there's much, I think, there's an expectation that's created with that we're going to, share longer responses, have a actual meaningful discussion. So one of the interesting things as well with threads is that it's allowed us to have discussions asynchronously a lot more effectively. And so before we would either struggle in Slack to have those discussions, or we would feel that we always needed to set up a meeting, jump on Zoom, have a discussion, try and get everyone on there at the same time. And so I think it's been great for that. And if anything, now we might be swinging the pendulum too much the other way to asynchronous, where I think actually getting on a call, on a video call, can be really effective to reach decisions.
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much for all this. Last question I want to ask is just related to like where you think things are going next. I mean, Buffer has been working on this for the benefit of so many, remote companies. And so you've been on the forefront of it for a while. What are you thinking about? What are you thinking about now? What do you think is like the next set of challenges specifically related to remote work that companies will face that you're starting to bump up against?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time because, we've been at it for 8-9 years. And when we started, we were amongst just a handful of companies that were doing remote, at least to the extent that we were.
Yeah.
And then fast forward today, there's I feel like most startups getting going now are remote. And if they're not, they're kind of aware that that's putting them at a disadvantage. So the landscape has changed pretty drastically. But at the same time, I think for me, I wrote articles 4 or 5 years ago about remote, and I really thought that it might be even more prevalent by now than it is. And I think especially in larger companies. And one of the key things is that there's still a lot of kind of fear around are people getting their work done, or there's still a bit of a power and control type thing going on, especially for larger companies. And so I think that's something that really needs to shift in the next 5 years of remote. It really needs to be, let's focus on trust, on, giving more autonomy. I think that's really, in a lot of ways, the beauty of remote work is that it's kind of tied to this greater freedom for team members. And so I think for me, what I'm hoping to see as well is a continued push on asynchronous. Hopefully that becomes, even more effective. But also this just greater freedom for employees. I think I would love to see that continue. And whereas I think, you start to see set down time zones for remote companies or things like this that I feel like are not going all the way. So I hope there's an underlying push, and that's probably where I think, these days a lot of new companies are remote, but the ones I think that are going to be at the forefront of the next wave are going to be the ones that are pushing even to give their team members even more freedom and autonomy and trust.
How can our listeners find and follow you online?
Yeah, my Twitter is my username is Joel Gascoigne, which is a little hard to spell, but if you go to my website, which is joel.is,
there you go.
Then you can find the link to it, and my Instagram and all the other places. And then buffer.com for Buffer.
My guest today has been Joel Gascoigne. Joel, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. I really enjoyed that conversation. Hope you got a lot out of it as well. So let's do some closing thoughts. I will apologize that I am battling and have been battling a cold. and so I apologize. Well, but listen, so the first thing, I mentioned it in the interview, like in the middle of the interview, but what a testament to remote work and to Buffer's processes that the CEO is able to move, and it is not a catastrophic or major company event. It just says so much about one of the major benefits that this model gives to you. It's a massive competitive advantage if you can make it work, and if your practices and processes are as solid as Buffer's are. And no doubt that has happened over many, many years and many iterations of trial and error. But there's also a lot of lessons that have been learned in that time, and here we are all reaping the benefits of those lessons learned and taking some shortcuts not shortcuts, but having the opportunity to leap over a few of those learning curves. It was also interesting, Joel just kind of mentioned it, just kind of in passing about spending time in those other time zones. I went back and listened, and it sounded like he was just kind of mentioning it as sometimes you're on vacation or in a like extended stay in another part of the world, but to spend an extended amount of time, 7 hours, from your typical time zone, 12 hours to put yourself in the shoes of those team members who might be in those areas where there aren't a great concentration of other people, certainly would, operate as a really great stress test, to see, where do we have things out of sync here? Where can we make some improvements and adjustments? One of those things that he mentioned specifically, is recording all hands meetings and sharing them. And so I do wish I had followed up, like what is the exact process for that? Is it automated? Does it have to be manual? Is somebody, in the meeting responsible for uploading it to a certain place and then putting the link in Notion, or, what is that? What is that process? And is there a way for it to be automated? That would be helpful. It was also really interesting to me that Joel mentioned that they are intentionally hiring in less represented time zones where they don't have concentrations of other Buffer team members. Something I have been seeing on job postings for remote positions is saying specifically, we with a preference of plus or minus, 4 of U.S. Eastern time, or what, it's just an example, but like having a preference for a time zone that has a lot of overlap. Buffer's doing the exact opposite thing to say we want to hire more people in those areas to force us to be even more flexible and asynchronous, so that common obstacle is so that we can get processes in place and adjust our company so that that's no longer an issue. Pretty interesting approach there. Let's see. Also, he was mentioning this practice that I've seen a lot of people do, which is to intentionally shift all hands meetings or even departmental meetings by time zone. So this week it's at U.S. Eastern. Next week it's Pacific time. Next week it's whatever that becomes, negative 12 GMT, whatever. But each week or each month, depending upon the frequency of the meeting, it continues to just like rotate its way around the world, so that no one concentration of team members is always preferenced, or and that no specific group of team members is constantly unable to attend the 11 p.m. Meeting and is always watching it on demand the next day. So just really practical piece of advice right there. So super helpful. The question about how do you schedule an emergency all hands meeting? That's something his answer is, well, it's pretty low tech. We have everybody's phone number, in a document. And in the rare event where we do need to get everybody around the world on the phone, you got to reach out and text or call people and say, hey, hop into the Zoom room. That seems very practical. I had asked Sahil, CEO of Gumroad. He had mentioned something. I forget exactly what the thread even was, but he had mentioned something, and I asked this question because it had come up in a few of the conversations that I was having and consulting with some folks, and his answer was, yeah, that just doesn't really happen. The question of what do you do when you have an emergency meeting and really need to get everybody on the phone, within 2 hours or whatever the time may be. And it's like, it doesn't really happen. That seemed very impractical, and okay, well, it's gonna chances are pretty good, like rare as they may be, that sort of event is going to happen, and sure feels like a very actionable and simple way to address it is, well, yeah, be sure your company handbook is up to date, and hope that you don't have to use that page of it very, very often. This other thing about establishing boundaries, being able to unplug, because of being across multiple time zones, and just the downside of the whole, baked in thing of remote work of, we don't really worry about, hours in your seat. It's about output. Those things overlap so heavily, because, if you're the product manager and you're in one part of the world, and you've got, a couple of team members, spread across, it can feel like the onus is on you to be the one to be available for a 20-minute call at 10 p.m. your time. Which just elevates the importance of working asynchronously or preferring asynchronous communication, by default. He addressed this as well. Just the typical fear of managers of remote teams is, well, how do I know if everybody's getting their work done? The opposite is almost always true, that people end up working more hours to show that they aren't slacking off, that they are getting more work done, and it's just that's going to lead to burnout. I also really appreciated the anecdote he shared about being aware that when you type somebody's name or into Slack, that it's going to notify them, or that it might notify them, and that people on their team try to be aware of what time zone other folks in. I mean, the first thing is to have some sort of recommended notification settings for your team, and then to communicate, we don't expect you to respond to notifications outside of your working hours. There was, back in the summer of 2017, we lost my dad to lung cancer, and so my two the two co-founders I was working on a startup with at the time, we're still just having to plug away and keep at it, and they needed to be able to refer to me in the conversation. There were things I was responsible for, and so for a couple of weeks there, they just referred to me as Brian with a Y, spelled my name with a Y, so that it was, it made sense in reading it. It's not like they had to come up with a code word for me or anything, but like I've always thought that was just a very mindful and very considerate and caring thing to do. And it is something that teams can do in this day and age of notifications being, oftentimes a little too aggressive. And even though we know better, sometimes it's hard. It can feel addicting to want to know, like, what was the latest thing in that? Where does that conversation stand in Slack? Has so-and-so responded to my email yet? And so as we take it upon ourselves, to have some personal responsibility to own that, it is also nice to extend a bit of grace. and put some effort into making it easier for your teammates to also not feel that by being aware of what the notification is going to look like on the other side. I was pretty convicted by the conversation about sabbatical. What did he say? 6 weeks every 5 years or something. This is another one of those things about, modern employment that sounds like such a progressive and thoughtful, or just a progressive idea that's actually, quite an ancient bit of wisdom. And so just a really great practice that Buffer has put into work there. Definitely feel like I could use a sabbatical from time to time. These days, self-employment, doesn't necessarily lend itself to a sabbatical, but for sure, just the notion of being able to unplug for a while. We do come back more creative, both at like the macro level, saying take 6 weeks every 5 years. That's smart. But at the micro level as well, when the weekend comes around, actually unplug. I have been so bad about this recently, I feel like, and counterintuitively, because I do feel like there are so many things that I'm thinking about and trying to work through. It usually means I continue to think about them and work through them over the weekend, which unfortunately does not make it easier for me to think through and work through them when Monday comes. And so this is another one of those areas where it's important to have practices and accountability in place to help us do the things that our short-term, mind and urges don't want to do, but definitely better for us in the longer run. Let's see. We talked a bit, they've the idea of buddying during onboarding, having a role buddy and a culture buddy. So it's just a super strong process, having a role buddy that you can ask specific things to your role about, then having somebody outside of your department that you can ask kind of larger that's not the right, like larger perspective questions about the company. What's this term mean that people keep throwing around? Where do I go for, this question about HR or whatever? It's important to have that buddy outside of your role so that you're not, that new hires aren't, pestering is not the right word, but when you're new, that is the thing that will keep you from asking important questions that will save time. Is the feeling of not wanting to be pestering the same person, and Buffer certainly modeled that and shared quite a bit about it. And yeah, finally, I appreciated it, coming down in the end again around moving toward trust and autonomy. That as companies get better at remote work, as more teams begin this practice and continue to mature the practices of remote work, it'll move toward, or it ought to anyway, it'll move toward trust and autonomy. It will not, effective teams anyway, will not introduce more tools to provide more oversight or more tracking or more check-ins. I don't think that that's what it'll do. More effective teams will actually go towards less specific tracking of time and specifics, and instead enable employees to do their best work in experience, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. If you've not read Drive by Dan Pink or watched his TED Talk called The Surprising Truth of What Motivates Us, I think that's the title. That'll definitely get you there if you search for that. Okie doke. That's it. I'm going to go take a Dayquil and get through the rest of this day. I would always love hearing back from you all. What do you think? Anybody that I haven't spoken to that you would like for me to reach out to and get on the show, you can find me on Twitter. I am BRhea. That is BRHEA. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you next week.